Good afternoon. We'll start. Thank you all for coming, and we're very pleased to have Barbara Ibrahim as our first speaker in our series of talks that we will be giving lectures over the next 6-9 months related to youth issues, youth research and youth-related issues throughout the region. This is one of 3 programs that we're launching at the Essam Faris Institute, one on youth, one on climate change and environment, and a third one on Palestinian refugee camps and their host communities throughout the Arab world. As you see, we pick easy topics, but we get the best people to talk about them, and we're very pleased to have Dr. Barbara Ibrahim, especially representing her long tradition and legacy of fine scholarship in the Middle East. She's a graduate of AUB with a master's degree, and on a personal level, I think had her first child here as well. So has a strong personal link to AUB. Now is at the American University of Cairo, where she's the director of the Gerhart Center for Philanthropy and Civic Engagement, and has been active for many years in the Middle East in research. She's a sociologist by profession, and she was the regional director of the Population Council in the Middle East and North Africa, based in Cairo. And she will be speaking to us today about the research that she and colleagues have done in Egypt related to youth activism and other issues that she will talk to us about. And she also represents the spirit of collaboration that we are very keen on promoting with colleagues throughout the Arab world and the rest of the world. And we expect to be doing some work together over the years on youth issues and other things. So, Barbara, thank you for coming, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you very much.
Make sure to speak into the mic. So.
Well, it does feel very nostalgic to be back at a place where I spent a really meaningful part of my early career, trying to figure out how to get a master's degree and my thesis fieldwork done while I was giving birth to our first daughter. I may have been the only patient at AUB Hospital that had their questionnaires spread out on the bed at the same time I was nursing a newborn. But those were wonderful years for my husband and myself. AUB's remained in our hearts as we've continued our careers mainly based in Egypt. So I always jump at opportunities to come back to AUB and to Beirut. If you share with me the view that the title of this talk oversimplifies a very complex reality, we are in a minority. What I've come very much to see about the way youth and discourses around youth are treated in our part of the world in particular is a very didactic, very simplistic approach. And if you don't doubt me, turn on state television or a radio program that has call-in questions and answers for young people to see how unrelated to the realities of our globalized world, the sort of advice that adults are giving to young people in the Arab world today. Every country seems to have had a historical moment in which it valorizes the participation of youth. They are going to be the saviors of the nation. Often it's at that post-revolutionary moment in Egypt, like the early 1950s. Perhaps in Lebanon you felt it briefly in 2005 with the so-called Cedar Revolution, that somehow young people are going to save us. But that is replaced usually rather rapidly and for a much longer time by a more persistent discourse in which youth are dangerous, they are the source of problems, and they are a likely sector of infiltration of bad things into society, whether it's militant Islam, drugs, bad aspects of globalized youth culture. It's amazing the way one generation of young people today in the Arab world are both lacking in aspirations and values and yet succumbing to Islamic militancy. Kind of hard to figure out how these two ideologies coexist. Another problem with youth is that there's simply too many of them. The demographic youth bulge that we're all so aware of, in which the largest ever cohort of young people are trying to find their places in adult society. Places in the labor market, figuring out the marriage market, starting families, and figuring out pathways to public participation and to taking their place in civic structures. Rather than taking that kind of dichotomized look, and I should say here that, and I apologize if anyone's attending the lecture because they hoped I was using an asset-based analysis of youth problems. I very much admire that as a useful tool, I think especially because it enables us, as we think about assets that communities, families, or individuals bring to social interaction, it's an important way of understanding that there are non-tangible assets, like social capital or like resiliency, that young people can bring to the table even if they're disadvantaged in some other ways. But I'm not going to use that particular analysis format. What has informed the work that my colleagues and I are doing specifically on Egypt, I'll mainly be talking about urban Egypt today, but I'm very interested to hear back from you about whether our findings resonate with your own social settings. We think in terms of frameworks of social exclusion. By that I mean systems in place in a relational and a very dynamic way in which there are both excluders and the excluded. We find that this kind of dynamic enables us to identify the problem not with youth and not with those that are facing exclusion, whether they're an ethnic minority, a religious minority, or in this case, young people, but to identify problems in the systems, whether they are labor markets, marriage markets, systems of civic exclusion or civic participation. And the question that we wanted to ask ourselves in Egypt was, given the fact that this is a generation finishing education and then not finding jobs, not making a smooth transition to the labor force, not able to marry, sometimes remaining in a kind of limbo of engagement for years while these couples try to accumulate the sums of money needed for them to start marital life together. Given that families are often places where social exclusion of the young has its earliest roots. And I was mentioning to a group of you in a youth research coalition this morning that in research we did in rural Egypt, we would hear plaintive responses from young women like, in all of my life, I've never held the remote control of our family television set. So this sort of hierarchical environment that we may criticize our political institutions for has its origin in families. And it's not just a gender hierarchy, it's also very much an age hierarchy. So that young people are trying to figure out adulthood, trying to come of age when there are overlapping systems of exclusion that in some cases, and especially in Egypt, are becoming worse for them and not better. The framework of exclusion is interesting to me. It had its origins in the work of social scientists in Europe who were looking at immigrant communities of youth in urban places around Paris. It's been taken up very much by the policy community. And so you will find European political parties actually running and succeeding to get into office on policies of social inclusion that is going to make a place for immigrant communities, minority communities, gypsies, whatever. So it's an interesting framework that has both analytic and policy implications. And I've noticed that the Brookings Institute, in its cooperation with the Dubai School of Governance, are very much taking on this as the rubric in which they're trying to understand dynamics of youth in the Middle East. In Egypt, we were struck by a growing phenomenon that's really been flying under the radar When public participation of youth is media-friendly, like street demonstrations or violence, such as we experienced a few years ago during the Eid, when kind of random groups of young men on the streets in downtown Cairo began attacking women, seemingly without pretext. Those are the kinds of things that capture media attention, get a lot of discussion, and sort of enter into the rhetoric of what's wrong with young people. But we felt that if you think about public participation of young people as a continuum, and you put at one end of the continuum organized, political, and usually religiously motivated extreme activity, which is often covert but certainly has a public manifestation. The other end of the pole is really our finding from earlier survey research done about a decade ago in Egypt, which is that the vast majority of young people in Egypt are doing nothing. They are not in school, they are not working, they are not progressing toward marriage and family formation. If you're a young woman, you're almost constricted entirely to the domestic sphere in which they're waiting for something to happen to them. If you're a young man, you may have the street as your sphere of activity, and hence these kinds of episodic or seemingly unpredictable outbreaks of violence or of a kind of explosion of antisocial behavior. If you think of that as the other end of this continuum, what becomes clear immediately is that the vast majority of young people fall at neither end. We don't have thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people involved in either of these ends of the continuum. So what's going on in the kind of vast middle range? And that was the question that we asked ourselves. And we became very struck by a phenomenon not so well studied, analyzed, written about, or talked about, which is youth-founded and youth-run organizations that are involved today in social service in local and community levels. Some of these organizations have membership in the hundreds, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. But a couple of them are huge. Risala, which is probably the largest youth organization in the Arab world, has 70,000 registered members in Egypt. Its founders estimate that about 10% of those are extremely active and the others are occasionally active. And clearly that's still a minority of the youth bulge in Egypt, which is probably about 24 million if you take the ages 15 to roughly 30. But 70,000 is enough to begin to think about a kind of a movement and to be, we should be interested in how that is structured and what motivates young people to do this. And why is it happening now? Why didn't it happen in their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation? And I'd like to come back to that. Okay. Let me say a little bit about how we went about collecting information. We selected 3 of these organizations. Each one of them is slightly different in its recruitment methods, in the pool of young people that are recruited into it. Each of them has its strongest base in universities and recruits mainly from university students. We're not aware of any that largely recruit outside of universities, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. I've already mentioned Risala. It's the largest. It clearly has a religious motivation for recruitment. But what's interesting to us about Risala is that once you enter the organization or the doors of one of its local branches, religion isn't mentioned. And religion doesn't dominate the rhetoric about what they're doing or why they're doing it. It's about social service. And I'll come back in a minute and I'll talk to you about some of these discourses that are used by Risala members. It was started at Cairo University. It spread relatively quickly to other university campuses in Cairo. There are now 37 branches. They largely do activities that young people can manage. They're not particularly complicated. They're things that you can succeed at rather rapidly, but have a high kind of return on volunteer effort. So if you're a member of Risela, the only requirements are that you try to live up to a commitment to volunteer as many times in the week or the month as you claim that you are able to do, and you pay £10 a month, 10 Egyptian pounds membership. Now, that's about $2.50. That's affordable to almost all Egyptian kids. It's the kind of money they would spend on food or entertainment. But if you multiply it times 70,000, you start to realize that they're mobilizing the sums of money to build facilities, to create equipped laboratories in which they teach disabled kids. They run orphanages. They have literacy programs. They collect medicines from the free samples that are showered on doctors now all over Egypt, and trained pharmaceutical specialists then distribute these medicines for free to families that need them. One of the activities that I particularly like is that if a young couple are planning to be married and they don't have the financial resources to do that kind of at a level of material dignity which their community would require, Risela goes around to middle-class families like ours and collects all the gifts that you've received and you've put up on the high shelf because you didn't like them very much or you had duplicates. And they recycle these glassware and tea sets and the kind of zina that make houses attractive, cooking pots, into gihez for young brides and grooms, including the clothing that they will wear so that they can marry with dignity. So these are the kinds of activities that are done by Risela and also by some of these other organizations. The next organization that we took a close look at is called Al-Shenek Yabaladi. This was formed at the American University in Cairo, so by a more, I would say, elite kind of professional class of young students. In translation, it means "for you, my country," so you can see that it has a kind of a patriotic or nationalistic overlay to its motivations for joining. There are roughly 400 members in Al-Shenek Yabaladi right now, and as students graduate from AUC, they become members in a registered Gamaya, which continues to serve in one particular urban poor community in Cairo. The third organization is a little bit different in that it's not doing community-based social service. It is made up of largely successful and professional young Egyptians now scattered across the region, and some of them in Europe and North America, who are part of Nahdat el-Mahrusa. Are any of you familiar with that, or do we happen to have members of NM in the room? Okay. My son is a member. He's currently living between London and Indonesia, but he stays connected via a listserv and a very active, I would call this a youth think tank, basically, for Egyptians, which basically has as its thesis that the older generation has failed to solve our problems. It is neither providing us a smooth entry into adult life, nor is it handing us a society as healthy as we would like it to be. So we need to hammer out solutions to Egypt's problems, and we need to incubate and to initiate solutions. So to give an example of how NM works, recently there were a spate of sectarian violence in Alexandria and Cairo, and this led to a series of small discussion groups between Copts and Muslims within NM that were very much oriented toward practical solutions, not sort of let's talk and let's have a dialogue, but what can we do to change education, public awareness, to get a solution to this problem in Egypt. They're also right now looking for investors to open a democracy cafe, very similar to one that I think had its origins in Beirut, a space in which young people can come together in places like Cairo and talk, not just spend their money. And they see themselves as incubators of these ideas that then would be spun off while they incubate new ideas. So those are the three organizations. We randomly selected volunteers based on lists that were given to us by founders, and we did in-depth interviews with both long-term volunteers, recent volunteers. Wherever we could, we found dropouts to try to understand why kids didn't stay in these organizations. We looked at young men and at young women. We also did interviews with founders. We wanted to understand how the origins of these three organizations were different. And we're now also trying to understand how branches and spin-offs happen in an organization as big as Risela. Obviously, the original founders can't be involved in every branch. So what's the franchising method, as you will, for an organization like Risela? The interviews covered 9 different themes related to motivation, to their experience as volunteers, to models that they hold of how societies change, what are their personal social networks, what are their future aspirations and plans. And we're in the process of analyzing and completing these interviews. So what I'm presenting you today is very much work in progress. Okay. Let me address a question that always comes up when I present this information. Has Egypt not had a very long tradition among its elites of a kind of noblesse oblige, top-down social service in which those who've been privileged in society go out and do some charitable activities for those who have less? Yes, there is a long tradition of charitable associations in Egypt, but to our mind, what makes this absolutely unique is that those were always adult initiatives. Youthful voices and participation were usually not even welcome. You had to have a few gray hairs before you were involved in the leadership. So the fact that these are youth-led, youth-directed, and certainly sustained by youth volunteerism, we think makes them unique and certainly worthy of study. They also seem to us to have more sustainability than some of the more politically oriented youth initiatives that took up public space roughly from the years 2004, 2005, 2006. And I'm sure you've heard of the Kifaya movement, Youth for Change, some of the Facebook and internet-based activities that seem to ebb and flow. And what we think is interesting about the volunteer organization, and probably in common now with Facebook and some of the ways in which civil disobedience seems to be reviving itself in Egypt, is that the founders of these particular pathways to participation have basically taken a look at confrontational street politics and decided that it's going to meet with failure. These are modes of participation that the state is particularly good at thwarting. They hire some thugs, they bring out state security in force, they arrest and jail protesters, and usually it's only a matter of months until those kinds of avenues of participation are virtually without members. But what seems to us to be shared in common both with these social volunteer organizations and also now some of the new Facebook and internet-based organizations is taking milieu and technologies that young people understand, choosing sectors in which to work that have been traditionally applauded by adults and by establishment actors. So who can argue with providing services to the poor or helping young people get married or teaching literacy to school dropouts? It's a way of flying under the radar but building leadership, building cadre of active and proactive and networked young people. So keep those kind of analogies in mind as we go forward. Another thing that's often said to me when we present this information is, well, but what about the social activism of the 1950s and 60s? Wasn't there a moment in Nasser's Egypt in which there was a lot of youth mobilization and participation? And that's absolutely true. There was mandatory social service. There were literacy corps that went out into rural areas. There was a mobilized moment of young people in Egypt. But I would argue that that was very centralized, very much organized and managed by the state. It was not spontaneous. You did not decide that you were going to go out and do something different than the party said you were going to do. And so even though it was a moment when coming of age for young people was characterized by hopefulness, by a sense that one was participating to build the nation, and there are some in the room who were part of that generation and might want to speak to it, its structure and its origins were very different. So the grandparents of today's young volunteers were probably parts of those generations and those movements. That was followed in the late 70s and the 80s by what we often call the Infitah generation. Those that came of age when Sadat was opening up to a market economy. He was turning away from the sort of socialist, nationalist model of development toward one that was much more free market oriented, when there was a kind of privatization of aspirations, if you will. Young people were thinking in terms of personal careers, finding a place in these new markets. If they couldn't, if Egypt's economy couldn't absorb them, they had the avenue of migration to other Arab countries. So that was very much a time in which there was a lot of circulation of young people in the Arab world, but not so much a sense of being thwarted, excluded, or left out. So the parents of today's young cohort of volunteers also were not particularly motivated to look for their own youth-driven sectors and ways of participating. Okay, what about this current youth generation? Well, if unemployment for first-time job seekers is over 50%, it rises higher for university graduates, and it rises even higher still if you're a young female entrant to the job market. If there is no housing and if there is no way for you to start your family life, very few avenues are open to you, and you don't want to sit at home. You don't want to be on the street corner. You would much rather be with peers and have socially acceptable places and ways in which to gather. So it's understandable that a call like Risala's would have the kind of response that it has had. There is an interesting way in which I think as well two phenomena are fueling this kind of youth volunteering, and it certainly came out in the interviews. Some young people are very explicit about it, but I want to note them for you, and then you'll hear it when I quote from some of their discourses. One is very much a kind of neoliberal acceptance of the fact that the state is withdrawing from social services, and it's absolutely failed to create spaces, jobs, and avenues for their entry into adult life. They kind of have a sense that they're going to have to make it up for themselves. They're going to have to do it. And whether they're happy or unhappy about that, they're not returning to a kind of socialist ideological rhetoric that sort of says the state should come back in and do these things for us. They're much more accepting that that's an era that has passed, and if anything is going to change, their generation probably is going to have to figure out what the pathway and what the avenue is. But the second motivation, and this is one that pervades every single interview that we've had with very few exceptions, is that unlike the secularist, nationalist, more technocratic, let's say, oriented discourses of young people in Nasser's Egypt or even in Sadat's Egypt, there is a religious discourse and a revival of piety and thinking about the community in religious terms that absolutely is constituent to the way young people frame their participation in public life, and particularly this kind of social volunteering. A term that is very much in parlance right now to explain why they do this is thawab. Thawab, which is a kind of accumulation of capital, let's say, spiritual capital, both in this life and in the afterlife, was a term I never heard. You know, in 25, 30 years of social research in Egypt and with young people, but in the last 10 years is heard increasingly. And young people are very explicit about it. If I'm going to spend my time doing something public or social, I might as well be getting thawab. I might as well be getting spiritual credit for what I'm doing. Thawab. Thawab. Yeah, from tawa. One male college student put it to me exactly like this. Each of us is part of the wall holding up our Muslim ummah. Each of us is a brick. And if I do my small part, the ummah will become strong. That's not the rhetoric of the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, but it is very much a kind of constituent discourse of the young people that are involved in this kind of movement today. The same volunteer, when we asked how volunteering made him feel, responded, "I feel closer to Allah. It makes me feel at peace." When asked why he continues, he mentioned several reasons. He has fun, he gets to see his peers, it's nice to be with other volunteers in the evenings after university classes. But the first reason he gave for continuing was, "I am accumulating good capital in this life and in the next." A young female volunteer put it simply, "If I'm going to use my time, I'd like to do something where I can get thawab." This is so pervasive that we really do have to conclude that a revival of religion is also creating a revival in thinking about ways to be in the community and to participate in public. And one of my young colleagues is actually exploring a thread of this, which is kind of de Tocquevillian in a way, that thinks about the virtuous citizen helping to create the virtuous society. The virtuous Muslim creating the virtuous society.
Are these only the kids in Risala? Or
No, it was in all three of these absolutely, all three of these organizations. Maybe a little bit more sophisticated and, mixed in with other motives in Nahdat al-Mahrusa, but absolutely there. You just scratch the surface and it's there. And in Christian organizations, I would argue as well, although none of these happen to be Christian in character. And apps to work with them, and it's been priests in local churches that have objected and basically said, you're drawing young people from our volunteer social activities. So clearly creating boundaries in minority communities is clear in Risala that if you think about the sectors of volunteering, they rather follow the kind of religiously mandated care for orphans, the widows, the disadvantaged, the wayfarers. One can see that the early ideas came out of those kinds of understandings. But what's interesting about Risala is that every time a young person brings a new idea to their branch office, it's taken seriously. If people can figure out a way to do it, these new ideas are incorporated. So every branch is now doing unusual and different things that are brought in by its members. But we were struck by the lack of religious rhetoric once you get inside the organization and once you see it in action. So while motivation is religious and personal meaning for doing it is religious, that has no place in the actual conduct of of these organizations. And there may be a good practical reason for that. They're also flying under the radar politically. We all know that the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist sects have used social services as a way of recruiting, as a way of winning votes or whatever, and I don't think that's unheard of in Lebanon from what I understand. So I think these organizations are walking a really fine line. They want to survive, they want to grow, they want to provide meaning for young people, and they want to do it in a way that doesn't bring the wrath of the establishment down on them. And I'll come back to what's happening as Risala grows in a minute. So while these organizations do not seem to us to be stepping stones toward more extreme or more fundamentalist expressions of faith, often parents have that fear about them. And so we learned from a number of the interviews that we took that parents were frightened or uneasy about participation in the beginning. One young man said, "At first my parents were very worried about what I was learning, what I was doing as a volunteer at Risala. Was this an extremist group that had recruited them? So I brought them to visit the center, and they were soon convinced." In fact, one of our observations is that all three of these organizations are encouraging an older generation to get involved, and the impetus is from the child. And that is turning on its head what we know about social service organizations in the Middle East, that they tend to be top down, that you have to have gray hair or be balding to be in the leadership. Certainly that would be the case in state-run organizations or ministries of youth around the region. The clear break between generations, however, is articulated. And another volunteer put it like this: "The Muslim society is weak today because our parents' generation moved far away from religion. We have come back, and now we know more than they did at our age about what is the true path." Why is it that there is deep religious commitment and motivation, but not so much going on within the conduct of these organizations? One volunteer explained it to us this way: "All of my friends are religious, and that helps me not to go astray. But when we enter the door of Risala, we don't ever mention religion. Religion is for the mosque. We talk about service and doing good, and we talk about those who need our help." From interviews with the founders at Risala, this was very much reinforced. They see themselves as providing contexts of meaning and conduits for social experience that's positive, that channels youthful energies, that provides something positive and proactive so that these youth don't slip into more extreme religious activity. So they see themselves as kind of bulwarks, I suppose you might say. The same appears to be true for Al-Shanek Baladi. They have, as I said before, this additional element of patriotism or nationalism. Their motto is "For God and for my country." One of the NM recruits told me that they bring new members into the organization in their promotional materials over the internet by challenging young people, "Do you want to do something to help your country develop?" That's kind of their motto. There's a stronger sense in these two organizations, both Al-Shanek Baladi and in Nahdat Mahrusa, perhaps because they draw their membership from a slightly higher social strata, that there is a need to give something back, that they owe something to their society, and there should be a reciprocity in giving something back. One of the leaders in Nahdat Mahrusa said it this way: "We want to engage Egyptian youth and overcome the state of apathy in Egypt. We encourage youth to think outside the narrow circle of me, my family, and my work." And then, as I said before, there's this neoliberal understanding that we are on our own, quote, "No one is going to help our generation." Now, just underneath all of this very lofty idealism and motivations to volunteer, we found some much more practical motivations and reasons. And I'm going to go through those rather rapidly so we can open this up for some discussion. One of them is that opportunities for social and peer interaction are extremely limited. If you're not in an institution like the university or school, in conservative communities and neighborhoods, young women in particular cannot leave home. Young men don't have opportunities to interact. And so the norms that allow for interaction before marriage are extremely limited. Families monitor girls' behavior, and you have to have legitimate spaces in order to justify getting outside of the home. So girls told us, much more often, in fact, than boys, that they could argue that going to volunteer and do good for orphans or for young disadvantaged kids enabled them to get out of home. Participation then for an unmarried girl is an alternative to doing nothing, sitting at home and watching television, or as some of them say, I'm waiting for my life to begin. Well, that led us obviously to another question, which is, well, what happens with this kind of male and female interaction inside the gates of these organizations? Are relationships developing? Do marriages get formed? Are there engagements? There was quite a bit of resistance to talking about this, and I suspect that's rather typical. Again, in conservative societies, you're not going to say that that's the reason that you're there. But we found it wasn't too difficult to scratch the surface and to get at this kind of motivation. Young men in Risela in particular felt a need to position themselves quite carefully in this particular discussion. And they would say things like, only bad young men come with this idea of meeting girls. We spot them very quickly. We try to convince them that it's wrong to relate to girls in this way, or we ask them to leave. Another young man said, I know the bad thoughts of most young men because I used to play around and I used to walk with girls. Yet there are some members here who do find worthy sisters and do become engaged to them. This happens and it's acceptable, and if the intentions are leading to engagement in marriage, that's fine. Somewhat more positive view of the possibilities in volunteering were stated this way. Hey, it's a free place where I can meet girls. I mean, think about, not having any spending money in your pocket. Where are you going to meet them? Well, if you can't do it at the cafe, if you can't afford the cinema, here's a free place to do it. But this fellow quickly added, some who come here with that attitude are won over by the chance to do good work. Others leave after a while. Couples do form in the kind of context of this volunteering, but there's something else going on. One of the males said, I feel about the girls here that they are known to me like my sister. If I found one who met my standards or criteria for a wife, yes, it would be good to marry a girl from here. We would share the same ideals. Yeah, it sometimes happens. This is Adi. Two of my friends are engaged to girls that they met here while volunteering. There's also one more very important reason for volunteering that I want to mention. It was the hardest one to get kids to talk about, but I have a feeling that it's quite resonant with many of them, and that is, if you can't get a leg up in the job market, if you're basically waiting for a first job or hoping for a first job, burnishing your CV is not a bad thing to do, and we see this throughout the class structure. So I think a lot of young people are volunteering both because it will give them something that's an edge or an advantage when they're in the eventual world of competing for jobs, and also more than one mentioned to us, maybe I'll meet someone who will notice me and offer me a job. Maybe someone at Risela or someone who's contributing to the hospital where I volunteer. Maybe they'll notice me and maybe I will get a job. So the economic motivation may as well be there. All right, what explains the rather phenomenal growth of Risela? Why 70,000 members? Perhaps enough of an explanation is simply in the kinds of social exclusion, the lack of alternatives that we've talked about. But I think there's also something to be said for the very creative ways in which these organizations market themselves. They're on television, they have advertisements during Ramadan, they're active in places where young people meet, to the extent that state security in Egypt has actually banned Risela now from all of the university campuses of the national universities. That's happened in the last year. It suggests to us that while they're trying to be very careful, while they're trying to stay away from overt politics and certainly religious politics, there is something rather threatening in these numbers to the powers that be. And when I talked to the leadership about how they responded to this, they said that they're not going to challenge it for now. They would much rather continue to recruit now in the neighborhoods and in the centers where they already have existing centers. The explanation that was given for closing them down was interesting. It was said, well, we know that your intentions are good. We know that you are not politically motivated, but, you know, there might be infiltration of your group, and so we wouldn't want you to be the conduit for bad influences. Now, interestingly, they didn't close the Risela chapter at the American University in Cairo. So I don't know what that says about our university as being obviously not threatening at all, not being a hotbed of potential activism, but also because it's the smallest of all the Risela chapters. You know, this kind of religiously based volunteering is much less appealing to the particular social strata and the kind of mix of other, you know, there are 50 clubs that AUC students can volunteer in. So Risela has played a relatively minor role. At a place like Cairo University or Ain Shams University, where these kinds of clubs do not exist, it's been much more potent and had the obvious then repercussion of closing it down. Now I want to come back to sort of what the future holds before we open this up for discussion. You may have heard recently that there was a strike in Egypt that on the 6th of April, the streets of Cairo were relatively quiet in solidarity with some of the industrial actions in Mahal al-Kubra because of skyrocketing prices and shortages of bread and other staples. There was a call for a nationwide strike. Young people were very much behind this. There was a Facebook group that was started by a woman in her 20s named Isra. It very quickly had 60,000 members in the days before the strike. It was so effective, in fact, that she was arrested the day after April 6th. She spent 3 weeks in prison. She was only released when her parents appealed to Suzanne Mubarak to let her out because she'd not broken any laws. She got 30 proposals of marriage when she was released from prison, which tells you about the kind of heroine quality now that these imprisoned young people are receiving. Other bloggers have been put in jail. Women in the media have been harassed and also imprisoned. There is a sense in which the state is threatened by the fact that young people have avenues, technologies, ways of mobilizing participation that aren't particularly well understood currently by the state. A new website just started up that is called We Are All Isra, and that is now getting thousands and thousands of members. So I think we have to assume that you will find more of these under-the-radar methods, more creativity on the part of young people to find channels in which the state does not have ready-made ways of closing down, imprisoning, or stopping action. I think there's going to be less happening, perhaps overtly on the street, and more that will involve the sorts of technologies and knowledge and non-ideological new ways of civil disobedience which are in the hands of young people. And my suspicion is that the leadership within these social volunteering organizations is very much going to begin to join forces with some of these other oppositional groups, and then you're going to have a very interesting new public space in Egypt. So stay tuned. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Let's wait for the mic because we are taping this.
For state security.
Yeah, that's right.
For the Lebanese state security or the Egyptian state security?
Allah.
We're open to everybody.
Okay. Thank you, first of all. But please allow me to disagree with you on some points. First, dismissing the earlier activism of youth, of Egyptian youth, as state-sponsored, I think this is not really fair because, yes, at the Nasser era there was this Al-Ittihad al-Ishtiraki and all that, but again, the demonstrations of '68, for example, were against the state. They were not state-sponsored. And then in '72 and then again in '77, the students were involved. This is one thing. The other thing, well, perhaps you've noticed, this is sort of a comment and a question at the same time. Perhaps you have noticed the overflow of charity activities on campus in AUC. And personally, having spent 4 years there, I have been suspicious and sometimes hostile to these forms of activities because I felt that it is sort of an upper class thing that is trying to, the upper class students are trying to clear their conscience and to assume that they are giving something without really engaging in social problems. And perhaps Risala is a bit different because it borders on empowerment. It's not exactly a charity organization, and definitely Nahdat al-Mahrusa is different. But overall, I wasn't that comfortable with these charity activities, especially that some of them, namely the Help Club, was acting against political mobilization on campus. And the last thing as one of the confrontationalists myself, I strongly disagree with you that street political confrontation was a failure. I don't know if you were at AUC in May 2003, but then we started the biggest demonstration in the era of Mubarak. And although on the next day the state security was able to stop it, I think this historical moment gave birth to what happened afterwards, to Harakat Kifaya and to the strikes that are going on. And again, Youth for Change, which was the most active branch of Kifaya, I think they mobilized the street in a way that is unprecedented, I assume. And what's happening right now, and the strike that you mentioned, I think they were all results of what was happening starting 2003 and then 2005 and then now in various forms of street political confrontations. So I would like to hear your feedback on this.
First of all, I probably wasn't clear enough about this. When I talked about what was going on in the 50s and 60s, I was talking about social service, not student activism. That it was state-sponsored and state-controlled. And you're absolutely right. There was a response against that was very much independent and autonomous and cracked down upon. A whole generation went to prison, as we know. And then they came out as the leaders and founders of the human rights movement. So you're right. I mean, and I should have, I think, and perhaps want to rework this to think about chronologies in which different, eras of activism build on each other, because I absolutely agree with you. And I didn't mean to say that street politics of 2003 to 2005 failed. I meant to say that their numbers have not increased. If anything, they've decreased. Kifaya membership, Youth for Change membership, and one reason is because those are tactics in which the state is fairly successful in repressing. Whereas some of these, let's say, more innovative or creative forms seem to me to have a higher likelihood of success because the state hasn't figured out yet how to close them down. Maybe it will someday, and then we'll have to find new ways. But I should have chosen my words more carefully. along with you, you know, I felt that this was the beginning of something when you saw large numbers. And it was amazing to us that AUC was in the lead in 2003. They were not followers. They, you know, it was very clear that you could be upper class and politically active and motivated and in the leadership, and that was important. A lot of the response to the Lebanese War of 2006 in Egypt was also initiated at AUC, and several kids went to prison for demonstrations. A lot of the mobilization of help and support here after the war was over, again, was being mobilized at AUC. So, yes, there's a stereotype in Egypt that AUCians are rich, spoiled kids, but I think it needs a little bit more complexity. So, charity at AUC, I could not agree with you more. One of the things that my center is trying to do is raise awareness about the difference between feel-good charity and social change. And the fact that the more you're educated and have skills and understand mobilization, the more incumbent it is on you to look for strategic ways to change society rather than just putting Band-Aids on problems. AYB, Al-Shanek Baladi, is very developmental. It's not politically active, but it's not charitable in its orientation. Help Club is interesting because I thought that was the sort of Muslim Brotherhood arm on campus. Is that not your understanding, or maybe that happened later?
It includes Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis and so on, but they are the pacifist side of the spectrum.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so my questions or comments come from a recent experience I had in Egypt a month and a half ago, where I volunteered. I went to Egypt and I volunteered there in the center in Giza for أطفال الشوارع. And throughout my activities, with the young people, and also we did activities with them, but also we went to حي الزبالين بالمقطم, and on the other side, I lived in a place in like a maison d'accueil, I don't know what hostel or something. Mm-hmm. It was the house of YMCA in Shari al-Gumhuriya, and we socialized with Egyptian students of AUC. So I got to see two sides of the spectrum, yes. Like those kids and those kids. And my question is, you said that these NGOs recruit from universities. What do you do about the bulk of the Egyptian youth who are not in universities? What do you do with them? What's your approach to that kind of youth empowerment? My second question is, when I saw, it was a shock to me to see حي الزبالين in the Mu'attam. It was like the shock of my life to see how it not only ecologically sustainable. First, it's like this place has 70,000 families or something. It's not like a neighborhood. It's a huge place. And not only how is it ecologically sustainable, but how is it that young people can just watch this, okay, and just hold back or not think about, not hold back. They're probably not holding back. Maybe I come with a stereotype, but do these places make young people think about like revolutionary change? Isn't it like when they see these settlements, don't they think why we should change it like now, like today? And my third question is about this approach. I know you talked about youth-led and youth-managed, youth-created organizations, but for a more like encompassing policy, don't you think that families should be the first unit to address, and when it concerns youth? Because my experience with the center in Giza was that families were the main reason why these kids ended up on the streets in the first place. Families who refused to integrate them, remarriage, and they had to leave, domestic violence, etc.
Okay, well, great big questions that probably need 3 more hours of discussion and all of you to jump in. Earlier this morning I met with some of you on the faculty that are thinking about programs directed to out-of-school and disadvantaged young people, and I was privileged to work on some of those in Egypt throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. I think I have no answers but a couple of directions as a result of that. The first thing I would say is that awareness-raising programs are just not enough, and that typically is the way that international donor organizations and some ministries and governmental authorities are thinking about. You know, if we just hold some informational classes or just do some empowerment, you know, we're going to kind of address the problem. The issues of exclusion are just too great for that, and so my sense is that interventions have to have some kind of practical engagement in the world as an outcome measure of their success, whether it's equipping kids with livelihood skills and then, you know, putting them together with microcredit programs that will give them the wherewithal to start a small business, whether it's job training and job creation that actually is linked to employment opportunities at the end, whether it's mobilizing young people. I mean, interesting work within this Zebelin community that you're describing is to work with young people from the ages of 10, 11, and 12 and think about them as future leadership in their own communities with, you know, the ability to identify problems, bring in resources, save, have savings plans so that there will be accumulated assets that the community can use. So those clearly aren't answers. Now, why is it that Egyptian society and all the generations view poverty every single day and look the other way and don't do anything about it? I mean, I think that question could be asked about the major social problems in all of our societies. We're born with it. We take it for granted. In a society like Egypt, the scale of things is so huge. I mean, if you think about, you know, a quarter of the population of Egypt being in what would be identified as extreme poverty, or let's say, you know, $1 a day poverty by most international measures, where do you start? So it's easy for individuals who are not in a mobilized moment in their society or in their, you know, public institutions to just sort of say, I can't do anything about this. Or I'm going to just give my zakat money and I'm going to hope, you know, that if everybody does that, everything is going to be okay. And what impresses us about the young people that are attracted to Risala or other organizations is this attempt in a small local way to do something, to take a step, and that maybe step 1 leads to step 2, leads to step 3. And as I said before, my kind of dream, which is that cadres of young people working locally, working nationally, working politically or working socially are going to start to come together. And I think when that happens, you know, you would have the beginning of what was witnessed in places like Eastern Europe, where revolutions happened, and sometimes they happened in days, right? Not months or years. Stay tuned, as we say.
Can I ask a question?
You're paying for my visit.
That's right.
You get to ask whatever you want.
Ahlan wa sahlan. The instigators or the initiators of these movements, were you able to identify the actual 1 or 2 or more people who started it and what actually motivated them and why they chose this form of activity?
Yeah. In the case of AY, well, I know all 3 of the founders. It's a woman. She was an AUC student. In the case of Alashanekia Baladi, she's veiled. She's extremely smart. I think she was a computer science major. But she's absolutely socially committed. And she looked around her society and she didn't like what she saw, and she started a youth club. And there was something in the way she structured it, in her appeal to others to join with her, that was very attractive. And I think AYB is now on 12 or 13 campuses. She graduated, but she formed the registered NGO, so she remains the president. She's now being so heavily funded by international agencies that some of us are a little bit afraid that, that early idealism and commitment could be diluted. But she's an interesting case. Risela, two things were going on. A young professor of computer science had come back from Canada, where he did his PhD, where he observed kind of social activism and societies in which citizens get together and solve their own problems. At the same time, he'd been the mosque imam at his little university because there were so few Muslims. So he was religiously active. He came back. He was teaching a course at Cairo University. He took his students out into a neighborhood behind the campus to see social problems. And they came back so sort of struck and upset by what they'd seen that they wouldn't let him leave it at a field visit. They said, we have to do something and we want you to help us do something. So that coalesced the first Risela chapter. Students not letting him get away. He happens to be quite charismatic, and so he's been very important in the kind of motivational talks that form new chapters. But he will not now go out and help a new chapter form. If you want to start a chapter of Risela, he will give you the tools and the kind of marketing concepts. He will advise you, but you're going to have to start your own chapter. Nahdat Mahrousa is interesting. It's another AUC graduate. But this fellow started with a kind of a pure community development organization where professional, educated Egyptians who didn't need, who had time to get involved and didn't need to spend all of their waking hours earning their incomes, they decided they were going to do an experiment in development without a penny of international or foreign donor money. They were going to initiate all of the funding to make a difference in the communities where they worked from Egyptian sources. And I think this touched a note. This was appealing to Egyptians. And so a lot of adults started supporting him. And Fatah Khir, which is the name of that first organization, was highly successful. He did that. He felt that it had some limitations of kind of locality and small things. And he had this dream of Nahdat al-Mahrousa, which would be more of the national linked think tank kind of an organization. So he went on to form that. And now he's thinking about his third organization. He's exceptional young man.
Hang on a second. Wait for the mic.
As a follow-up on Risala's funding or funders, how is it? Is it self-funded or sustainable within its own community? Okay.
A lot of the ongoing activities are self-funded from this £10 per growing cadre of young people per month. And that's an obligation that they are very religious about honoring. But when they need a building, or in recent times they built a hospital, for example, they get wealthy Egyptians, sometimes the parents, but often maybe someone who knows Risela volunteers who just admire this. They're looking for something to do with their money that they believe in, that they think is honest, that's not going to be corrupt. They know they can see the results immediately of what they do. So a couple of businessmen will get together and donate land and build a building. And then they give it to Risela, and Risela is responsible for maintaining it and doing it. Now, I would love to know the political orientations of these business people, and I don't. That's kind of phase 2 of the research, to try to find that out.
I think it's very interesting that the volunteerism you're speaking about is religiously motivated but not operated. But I'm also wondering if that's actually a good thing, since the issue of religion seems to be being constantly tiptoed around but never addressed. So I feel like maybe it's a situation where it might actually blow up one day. And the other thing is, how do you assure that these kind of spaces really aren't infiltrated by people who want to use them for more extremist, ideas or activities?
I'm sure that this latter is a possibility, but I think there's a lot of vigilance within Risala. If someone comes in the door and has a political agenda, they're sort of immediately identified and ushered out, and there are religiously based, more political places in which you can get involved. So this is the middle way. It's not the Ikhwani or the kind of politically motivated place to be. But I'm not sure that I agree with you about it being explosive to keep religion out. If you live and work in Egypt today, you are assaulted by religion night and day. From the amplified sermons on Friday to television to, you get in the elevator of your building and someone has plastered up a religious notice of some kind. So, in fact, there's a lot of religious noise in society. And I think that for young people to have a place where that's personal, but the activity is social and has immediate, kind of results that you can see, I think there's a kind of reinforcing satisfaction in doing something for someone who has, so little, that probably keeps it going. And there are plenty of other places for religious expression, believe me. Maybe Lebanon's different, but it's all over the place in Egypt.
Before we close, I just want to thank Josie Pshara, who did all the work for arranging this. Thank you, Josie, and thank you, Barbara, for coming.